Welcome to Something to Talk About, where I take all this gear that I've accumulated from way, way, way too many years of podcasting and I put it to a good cause. And in this particular case, we're going to actually have a couple of causes, but we're actually going to have our guest kind of introduce them because he's obviously quite close to them. So, first of all, our guest today is Joe Persia. Joe, introduce yourself for those that may not know who you are.
Well, thank you, Robert. My name is Joe Persia. I've been living here in Brantford for about 34 years now, ever since I got married and chose to make Brantford my home. But I'm originally from the Niagara region. And having chosen to make Brantford my home, I've discovered that this community has an awful lot to offer and a number of wonderful opportunities to contribute and make this such a great place to live and earn a living. So I am an educator by trade, as you mentioned. I teach kindergarten and have been teaching kindergarten for a number of years now. So early learning certainly has a special place in my heart. But through my involvement with education, as well as previously volunteering with Rogers Community Television, I've gotten to know a lot of wonderful, wonderful people here and been exposed to a number of other things that take place in this community that really bring to life something that I hold dear. And I've repeated as a saying before that communities are much more than just the bricks and mortar. They're how we look after each other and the things we do for each other and the services we provide for those in most need. And that's really where Brantford has become my home. So I want to emphasize that because there is so much to offer here in this community. And I've met some wonderful people. And when people when people meet you and start chatting with you and you demonstrate a little bit of an interest in what they're talking about, shortly after that typically comes an offer of, hey, would you like to help us out with, to which I've gotten very, very poor at saying no.
Yeah.
So, and that usually ends up, I can recall for a number of years, just thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to do all this? But at one time, Robert, I don't mind telling you, I was on the board of directors for the Rotary Club of Brantford Sunrise. I was on the board of directors for the DARE program, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. I was on the board of directors for Kids Can Fly. I was on the board of directors for the Adult Recreation Therapy Center. And I was running the junior golf program at the Brantford Golf and Country Club, all in that very same year. So it was just one of those things that when you hear about a good cause, of which Brantford has so many, it's very difficult to say no.
Yeah, it's for me, I kind of tend to focus on a couple of main ones and try to give my full attention on those ones as opposed to spreading myself too thin. But
Right.
having done a lot of interviews, you come across all these stories. And for someone like you, where, one of the prime elements of the series content that you have is, the constant in-stream of events and charities and causes and things that normally don't get people's attention, trying to find every little bit of eyeballs they possibly can. And they turn to us in many
Yeah.
cases.
Well, and my involvement with Rogers Television, I don't mind telling you. I mean, that people, the number of people that would stop me and say, "Hey, I saw you on Rogers Television." I'd be, "Oh, like, what was I talking about?" And they would tell me about some event, because one of the things that Rogers Television enabled me to do with my first involvement, and I have to give a big shout out to Patty Berardi and Jason Soulier, who were instrumental in getting me off the ground with Rogers Television, but it allowed me to keep my finger on the pulse of what was happening in and around the community. There were so many events that were taking place, and it gave me the opportunity to learn about those events and the organizations that offered those events and provided the infrastructure to allow those events to take place, where I really got to meet some great people.
I think that's the nice thing too, is when you're constantly being fed, for lack of a better statement,
Yep.
a constant stream of stories that you would normally not be exposed to. It's the ultimate discovery. Like I love doing interviews that I've never done before, so that I have to learn the content ahead of time, and that way it pushes me forward. I try not to have the same content over and over again. I try to make the content evergreen as much as possible, because you never know
Yep.
when people are going to listen to. So a lot of that does not necessarily work as well for things that have a short lifespan, where, the event is next week. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like my content is meant more for people that may come across us 10 years from now and get value. And I found that in many ways, because as we get older, we see these patterns. A lot of the patterns exist. So a lot of the knowledge that we pass on is repetitive. And education is a prime example of that. Is here's some core concepts, beliefs, structures, whatever that we've evolved over time. But that concept, that structure puts you in contact with so many minds. And like I said,
Right.
both from you as an interviewer on the various shows that you have, as well as an educator dealing primarily with kindergarten kids now, but you've done, seniors and you've done post secondary, if I recall correctly. You know, just those sheer touch points when you're the type of person, and I know you're this type of person because I've talked to you before, where you absorb from all of those connection points. It's phenomenal how much compound interest we get on those conversations and how it factors it into the next conversations we have. People like we're continually evolving from these conversations. So my first question, because that was the long-winded intro, is when you look back at all of these conversations, regardless of what the topic was and what the charity was in a particular case, what are some of those things that really stood out that seem to be a pattern when you look at it from a wider 10,000 foot level? Because most charities share certain structure and certain causes and needs and whatnot, and some do them poorly and some do them really well, So when you get exposed to so many of these variations, for the lack of a better term, what are some of those things that you may have picked up on over the years that might help charities, causes, and so forth going forward when they
Well,
have
Robert,
yeah.
and it's interesting that you made that connection for me, because it's a wonderful segue into to really, and I can speak about the connections I've made in chronological order, because in moving to Brantford and choosing to make Brantford my home, one of the very first people I met was a young lady by the name of Lori Santilli, who was at the time just leaving her position at St. Joe's Hospital to take on an executive director's role with an organization called the Adult Recreation Therapy Center, which, believe it or not, at the time it was called the Family Living Group, just transitioning to become the Adult Recreation Therapy Center. So, and her and I got chatting, and in her words, not mine, but in her words, she was kind enough to say that she felt like I had something to offer and might be able to help them out with some fundraising, because it was this fledgling organization that at the time received no government or Ministry of Health funding. So I asked her to tell me a little bit about this organization, and I thought, geez, that really does sound worthwhile. I think I can help you out. So I agreed to sit on the board of directors, and in doing so, I started receiving some stationery arriving at the house, board meeting agendas and minutes and things like that. And it was arriving on stationery that still had the old corporate name on it, the Family Living Group. And again, for lack of for the people that aren't aware of this, the Family Living Group and now the Adult Recreation Therapy Center is an adult day program for frail, elderly, and early dementia clients. But what was unique in this particular situation, Robert, was that as this stationery started arriving with the name Family Living Group on it, my wife said, "Wait a minute, what's this Family Living Group stuff? I thought you joined the Adult Recreation Therapy Center." And I said, "Well, that's true. We're just using up old stationery. We're trying to save some money, so we're just kind of piecemealing our way through until we use up all this old stationery." So she said, "Oh, so the organization you're involved with was actually at one time the Family Living Group." And I said, "Yes." Yeah. So then she proceeds to go to her closet and pulls out this old photo album. And it turns out her mother, my mother-in-law, a woman I never met because she had passed away before I ever met my wife, was one of the founders of this organization. So that really was something that made me think there really is something in the universe that draws people to certain causes. So that was something that made this particular cause very, very important to me. And since then, it's been a wonderful opportunity to see and learn about this segment of our population who really deserve a great deal of credit and deserve all the services we can provide to help them, improve the quality of life that they have, regardless of their circumstances at the present time. So, and it's really all about the quality of life and the quality of living that the Adult Recreation Therapy Center can help our clients with.
Yeah, it's great to hear these because, like I said, every time someone shares their passion project, there's typically either a family connection or a personal connection or something like that. But also, it's something where you didn't necessarily know you were going to be that passionate about that project until you really started coming into it. And I obviously have mine. You brought up another one earlier when we were talking about causes that really left an impression with you, and this one's a slightly more famous because it's got a worldwide presence, if I understand correctly.
Yes, the Dolly Parton's Imagination Library. Well, again, and it stemmed from my interest in looking at the clientele at the Adult Recreation Therapy Center. I became very interested in dementia and cognitive development and cognitive processes and the impacts that certain diseases and certain metabolic processes have on our brain and the structure and architecture of our brain and the function of our brain. So, of course, that led me to do some research and some reading, and I dove into the subject head first, so to speak, no pun intended, and learned absolutely as much as I could. And lo and behold, I came across a gentleman by the name of Fraser Mustard, who had done some seminal work in early childhood education. He and the Honorable Margaret McCain published the Early Years Study and talked at great lengths about how the early learning and lifelong health trajectories for an individual are largely set in those very early years. So the more we learn about the early years, it can actually help us understand a little better about how to improve the later years. So that's how that all came about, Robert. And it was fascinating. I consider myself so blessed to have had the opportunity to meet Fraser Mustard, Dr. Fraser Mustard, and have several conversations with him. Some of the books I have behind me on a shelf that you can't see because of my virtual background, but were books that were recommended to me by Fraser Mustard that talk about cognitive development and the early years and early learning and the important role it plays on our lifelong path. So that really got me started. And then what I soon discovered was that literacy, as I got into education, I began to see that here I was teaching grade 6. There were some children arriving at my classroom door that were really struggling with some of those literacy acquisition skills that should have been handled, in my humble opinion, much earlier in their academic career, so to speak. And I started wondering, why isn't that happening, or why is it so difficult for some children? So I made the move to a younger grade, asked my principal, and I made the move to a younger grade. And sure enough, still at that grade, there were some children coming to me with some difficulties. And I thought, got to be in the very, very foundational years, the earliest years. So I made the move to kindergarten, and again, was very interested in literacy. But as I made that move, I happened to come across a book in, of all places, a doctor's office that had a picture of Dolly Parton on the front of it, and it had the book lady. And so I read this article about this program where Dolly Parton, world famous country and western singer, was promoting an imagination library where her foundation made it possible to mail through the mail service a book every month to every child between the time of their birth and their 5th birthday, so that every child entering kindergarten would then have a library of 60 books, which to me just spoke volumes, because what I had discovered in some of my early research in early childhood and literacy skills, those questions I was having about why is this so difficult for some and not for others, led me to discover that the dearth of literacy in some households, the lack of literacy and not living in a literacy-rich environment, was really a key indicator of some of the success or lack of success that a child might experience in their academic endeavors. So, and I began to read some of the works. There was a wonderful book published by 2 researchers, Hart and Risley, called Meaningful Differences, where they looked at socioeconomic status. And we now know that they broke households into 3 different categories, either high socioeconomic status, medium socioeconomic status, or low socioeconomic status households. And they looked at the vocabulary demonstrated, or the vocabulary exposure in each of those households. And what they found out, Robert, was that the children in a relatively high economic, socioeconomic household were exposed to about 36 million more words than was somebody from a low socioeconomic status household by the age of 5. Mm. So if you can imagine that, just that the sheer volume of vocabulary that they were exposed to is tremendous.
Yeah, and when you also factor the fact of, internet access to a degree, those that are willing to use the internet for that purpose, as opposed to all the other purposes that it's being used for, the amount of content that is out there is,
yeah. I do want to caution you, Robert, because screen time is something, when it comes to young children, screen time is something. So using the internet for access to literacy is something that I think the jury is still out on. Yeah. It can be engaging for young children as the bulbs flash and the buttons make noises and the things that the kids click on, and there's so many things happening. But I believe the jury is still out on some of the research on how that impacts the sensory things that are taking place in a child as they're
digesting the content, if like a better term.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I know. Well, then, let's be clear. Nothing beats physical. You know what I mean?
True.
Tactile, multiple senses.
Well, Robert, I'll be the first one to tell you. Even with Kindles and with the electronic, these ebooks that you can now get on a device, there is still nothing quite like a handheld book. And I'm a firm believer that I would much rather sit down with a book in hand rather than an electronic device and scroll through pages electronically.
Yeah, I know. For myself, it's always been more the audio spectrum. So a lot of audio books and stuff like that, just because I was very mobile. But part of my issue as well in the past was I always got tired when I was reading, and this is something I didn't learn until much, much later, and that's because my eye strain. I never for the longest time had proper reading level lighting and stuff like that. Yeah. So you would get tired, and it was not an attention span. It was you were literally getting tired. So I literally had to change how I digested content, because my eye strain was taking some of that energy needed for the digestion of the content, if any of that makes sense. But it wasn't until much later in life that I realized that's what, and a lot of it was because I got a very weak eye. So it was, constantly this going on. For those that don't have the visual, this kind of doesn't make any sense. But a lot of kids go for years with a lot of undiagnosed hearing or visual or whatnot. And for the longest time, like I said,
well, auditory processing is very, very important. Visual acuity is very important. And what you're talking, even the cognitive demands placed on somebody, the cognitive demands placed on working memory. When a child is reading something, there's a certain amount of information they're expected to retain in their working memory that allows them to continue to read in a more fluent manner. So I'll break the process down for you a little bit. When somebody is reading, actually their eyes focus typically on very few letters, and they make these jumps of about 11 to 12 characters in length, 5 to 7 times per second. So a fluent reader is scanning across the page and very fluid circadian movements. So they call them saccades, these jumps of 7 to 12, 7 to 11 characters. But the outside, the periphery of those characters are generally speaking very blurred. It's only the very center that comes into focus. But that working memory, that part of our brain that recognizes certain patterns of letters and words and meaning that we're able to attach to it. So when you begin a phrase, you start to know what the rest of the phrase is going to be, that comes from everyday conversations with mom and dad, and your use of language and vocabulary. So those circadian jumps in a fluent reader are greater and more in number than somebody with a reading disability. So somebody, for example, with poorer vision would have a narrower scope and would make probably fewer jumps per second, and therefore the reading would start to sound more like this when somebody is reading, because they don't So, and
Yeah.
I could go on and on, but that's basically what it boils down to. So there you have the visual acuity aspect of it. But again, that phonetic and phonemic and phonological awareness that plays such an important role. Knowing that words rhyme, knowing that words can be chunked into certain parts. I recall, and it's funny we're talking about this because I can recall being in high school, Robert, and I came across a word in a book that I had no idea what it was. And I had to use, this was my very first inclination that gave me the idea that, wow, context is important. And I was reading about cars and this cleaning a car, and this person used this thing called a chamois. CHAMOI. And I thought,
come on,
chamois. It's a chamois.
Chamois.
That's like it just struck me as so odd that this word was spelled CHAMOIS. And I thought, wow, had I not really understood what would be used to clean a car, I never would have been able to piece together what that word was or what it meant.
When I grew up on military bases, as you well know.
Okay.
And so you're moving every 2 years. Okay.
Yeah.
The population of your class varies tremendously from nothing to nothing. And I remember grade 9, my class size was what, 6 people? Okay.
Wow.
Well, they had grade 11 was one person, grade 12 was one person. They put them together, type of thing, right? In any case, so grade 9 on the military base was completely different than secondaire 3 off the base, which is where I started the year, because I was actually pure French all the way up to secondaire 3, which is grade 9.
Oh, right.
And I actually got pulled from the civilian French school to be brought into the safety of the military school for very northern Quebec reasons. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
and,
enough said.
Enough said. In any case, I went literally overnight over the Christmas holidays from a pure French grade 9 education curriculum in French, secondaire 3, to a full English only grade 9 curriculum on base with a significant difference in class size and class diversity as well. But the lessons from that period of time was my brain, and this applies to me still now because, as you well know, it applies long term, is certain structures and certain words are still stuck in that French only brain of mine. You know, and sometimes the words are simple, but sometimes they're just ridiculous. Like here I am, a tech guy dealing with CPUs in French. That's a puce. A puce is a flea. You know, who goes and says, I'm going to figure out that a microchip is going to be called a flea? You know, and so then you're trying to do that with a 6-figure income, right? In any case, language is tough in its own right.
Well, and you've touched on something that is, well, you've touched on something that is, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the second language thing, because there is a significant body of research that indicates children who are exposed to a second language earlier in life,
guaranteed,
there is an easier or there's a facility, and there's again part of a French word facile.
Facilité. Ou facile, c'est facilement.
Ouais.
Oui.
But si je parle français.
Je parle québécois.
Oh, ouais.
Ouais.
Right. But so, I mean, the fact that these children exposed to that second language very early in life are exposed to different phonological and phonemic combinations and sound and letter associations that provides them with the ability to, again, later on adopt even additional languages and an ease with which they can adopt a certain accent. And so there's that whole aspect. The other thing I wanted to touch on in talking about this was the English language is probably one of the most confounding combinations of letters or symbols and sounds that one could ever possibly imagine. I mean, here we're having fun talking about this, FUN, and yet if I pick up the phone, that's PH, and you came from a part of Quebec where you had to be pretty tough, which is GH, where if you put any thought to it, where there's a GH that doesn't make a sound, how's that for, going full circle with the English language? I mean, it's incredible. And again, we ask early learning students, children who in that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old bracket, to recognize certain patterns and to be able to create words and meaning from these scribbles and lines they see on a page. In my opinion, it's arguably one of those skills that we may take more for granted once we have it than we ever possibly imagined was
possible.
there.
I know for myself, in many ways, I'm glad that I learned French first, because I think it made learning English easier. Having said that, English is, the le's and the las and the masculine and the feminine aspect
feminine,
of
singular,
French language,
plural.
all that stuff comes into play. The one thing that I find interesting, especially when you talk about kindergarten, my kindergarten class was on a base called Lahr in Germany.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so when you think about what my kindergarten experience was, we're talking bomb drills that weren't drills.
Yeah, no, very true.
I'll leave it at that.
And you know what? The word kindergarten, actually, Froebel was the one who coined the term kindergarten, and it came out of Germany.
Oh, there you go. That's where I had my kindergarten.
Yeah. So you hit the nail right on the head there.
I do find, though, and you said it best, and I'm sure you see it in those students that have had the dual languages, especially early on. It does become a lot easier to learn more languages. I was talking to a friend of mine in Boston. His daughter has got up to 8 languages now. And we're talking some spectacularly foreign languages that you would never think you'd want to learn. And she's just going through them one after the other, because there's a compound aspect. And I know what happens, especially when you bring up stuff like dementia or any mental degradation over time, if that's the proper term I can use. I'm a firm believer that my brain is the most important organ in my body. Like, the rest of my body is a limiting factor to me as far as I'm concerned. Put me in a jar, I'm happy.
And Robert, I don't mind telling you, some of the things we're learning, especially more recently than within the last couple of decades, what we're learning about the brain is, for years we thought, okay, your brain is your brain, and there's such a thing called an intelligence quotient, and people are either born with it or they're not. And what you have is what you have, and that's all there is to it. Whereas, yet when it comes to somebody's physical ability, we've learned that they can practice a skill and get better at it. When it comes to our health, exposure to secondhand smoke or to smoke can have an impact on the lungs, which are another organ. But what we've learned in the last 2 decades is that our brains very much so are experience oriented as well. They're experience dependent. So your brain is constantly monitoring its environment. And if you look at the subcomponents of the brain, the neocortex, which has become more evolutionarily important to us as we are universal problem solvers in this type of world we're living in now. But beneath that neocortex level was a paleo-mammalian brain, which served us very well at a time when we either needed to fight or take flight.
Yeah.
And then there's the reptilian brain even below that, which enabled us to freeze and stay absolutely perfectly still and not move as a defense mechanism. So these layers of structure and architecture that built up evolutionarily to help us become the kind of species that we are is just now starting to get the attention that it deserves about how important this. And I'm going to throw a term out there that you're hearing it, and you hear it used, in my humble opinion, incorrectly in some of the commercials that are promoting some projects and products and things like that. But they talk about neuroplasticity. And that plasticity is just the ability for the brain to adapt to its environment. And one of the things that I've been studying lately and have become fascinated with is the work of Dr. Stuart Shanker and Dr. Susan Hopkins, who are, I believe, way ahead of their time in terms of talking about self-regulation and helping early children recognize the need to, and I don't want to say manage their energy levels and tension levels, but just be aware of what their energy and tension levels are. That awareness is the first step of the process, and the more competent for lack of a better term, higher order brain in that dyadic relationship. So myself as a kindergarten teacher, if I'm working with a child who is extremely upset and I'm constantly at that child saying, why did you do that? Why did you do that? And pressing that child and that child is saying, I don't know. I don't know why I hit my friend. Chances are they're saying they don't know because they don't know. And they're shutting down and they're trying to get out of that situation that they fear is very threatening and very intimidating. So you would get far better results if you just help the child feel safe at first, made sure that they were aware that, no harm is going to come to them. And then you bring them around to understanding that, yeah, okay, here's what we think happened. You were excited because of this, and this, and that took over. So there's a whole science to it that is really starting to envelop our understanding of early childhood cognitive development.
It's funny, when you were describing that, I could actually see the three levels or the three tiers of the brain that you were talking about, where that initial reaction of the child was to hide, to become still, to freeze,
Yeah.
And then when pressed more at that point in time, and it got to a point where by comforting her, him, whatever,
Yeah.
you kind of remove that flee mechanism to stay, your comfort,
Yeah.
so stay. Then you were able to engage at the higher level, because like, of all the stuff that I loved from my university years was Maslow. I love the triangle. I love how everything builds upon, and you can just pull that bottom foundation. You can have all the just crumbling down. You got to look at it systematically. You cannot have a high EQ conversation with someone that has no concept of EQ. You can't expect someone to be self-aware if they don't even have a basic awareness. So if a child hasn't developed any EQ at that age, to have a conversation about value of self and what this means to you, and that stuff that really engages, I would suspect, the development, that becomes difficult, I would suspect. So you're kind of balancing those two, I would suspect.
You know what? And it is remarkable because that those brain structures and the brain architecture that enable you to make that connection with an individual child. So you're tapping into something that really allows you to share your calm with that child. And there's that the part of the brain that I talked about that is responsible for the fight or flight is the limbic region. And there's a phenomenon called limbic resonance. And I know because of your work with audiographic or audiophonic material, you understand how tuning forks operate. Well, this resonance is a phenomenon that takes place between my brain and a child's brain. So, for example, and we've always heard the expression, children are sponges, they absorb everything around them. So if I'm feeling stressed and anxious and I'm at my wit's end with what to do, and I'm at a very low energy level, but a very high tension level, the child's limbic region in their brain is going to pick up on those vibrations and sense that this is not a safe place for me.
Yeah. Well, it's almost, they've got all the sensors, but they don't have the diagnostics to figure out what all the meanings of the signal.
You know what? I couldn't have said it better myself. You hit the nail right on the head there, Robert, because that's exactly it. They've got the sensors and their antennas go up when they sense that sort of stuff. They're aware of what's going on around.
They're highly tuned at that point.
They're highly attuned. Yeah. They might not know how to cope with it. Yeah. And that's where it becomes the adult, either the kindergarten teacher or the early childhood educator, to help ensure that they feel, first of all, safe, because nothing's going to happen without safety. So you make them feel safe, and then you build on that relationship and let them know that they're okay, they're cared for, and that, okay, now let's look at what happened. And then you begin, and through modeling this process over and over and over again in what we call co-regulation, we eventually hope that new patterns unfold where they can start to self-regulate, and they start to self-analyze and self-reflect on these situations that have resulted in some of the situations where they've gone home crying or gone home and said they didn't have a good day at school because this happened and this happened, and then that meant this happened, and then they ended up being sent to the principal's office. Well, guess what? I'm not a firm believer in sending kids to the principal's office. I would much rather keep them in my classroom, keep them safe. And instead of isolation-based discipline, rather than separate a child from the group because they've done something wrong, I choose to bring that child a little closer to me and model how to do it correctly.
Yeah. If they're still, if they're willing to learn, and I think that, it's, I said this earlier regarding something else. There's two styles, I think, out there. It's those that have the willingness and I'm being very generic here, to address and fix a problem, and those that don't have the willingness to address and fix a problem. And I purposely address and fix because I really believe there's two stages there. You need to become aware of what is it that you're trying to fix. And problem is not necessarily the right word, but it's that second stage that you see engagement at all tiers. We're talking, throughout. It's so hard to get people engaged.
Well, restoration is certainly a very important part of it, but I have to disagree with you a little bit about the willingness, because based on my experience as a kindergarten teacher over the last 10 years, there isn't a child who isn't willing to want to be friendly toward, like they again, they may have not slept the night before. They may be extremely tired. They may be, something may be happening. Maybe mommy and daddy were having a huge fight at the breakfast table that this child was exposed to. So the energy and tension level in that household before the child even got to school may have been through the roof. Then all of a sudden you complicate things by, okay, the child has to come into your classroom where, and again, I'm not I'm not beating up anybody in particular, but a child enters a classroom where there may be as many as 28, 29 other little bodies crowding around where he's supposed to hang up his backpack and his coat, and somebody may jostle him a little or cause him to drop his backpack or drop his lunch bag where things spill out. So you can see how that energy and tension level keeps escalating and piling on top. And then all of a sudden he wants to go sit down on the carpet with his friends, and somebody is sitting in the place where he wants to sit, or sit next to the friend that he wants to sit next to. And again, that adds more tension and more stress. So is there a child out there who really is choosing to act out in a certain way? Maybe on the odd occasion there is a child who will choose to do something that perhaps they know they shouldn't do. But more often than not, a lot of what we see, if we reframe it and look at it through the lens of stress and energy responses, that child is telling you exactly what's wrong. Now, they may not use the words, and you have to become a bit of a detective to uncover what is really setting them off. But once you do that, and again, I'm just talking from my own perspective here, rather than get down on my on my haunches and be directly across from that child and stare eyeball to eyeball, I would much rather position myself right next to them, typically on their right side, and I would sit next to them and just talk in a very calming, soothing voice and let them know, you know what, I understand you're very sad. Yeah. And Mr. Persia gets sad too, and so you lower your tone of voice, you lower that register, you slow your speech down.
This is back to the resonance that you're using the resonance
exactly.
to model that behavior.
You create a sense of calm, and then you introduce the concept of restoration. Now let's go make this right with our friends.
So once again, you stabilize it, you figure it out, and I think maybe that was kind of what I was getting at. There's the assessment of, you need to figure out what the real problem is, because typically in a lot of these scenarios, what you see is not, it's a symptom of the larger issue. And I used to say this a lot about people commuting, is you're asking someone to do an hour and a half in the worst driving conditions and expect them to come in all bubbly in the office. You know what I mean? It's one of the reasons I've been preaching work from home for a very long time. I'd rather a person get up, have a coffee, go for a walk, come in and give me 2-3 hours of something solid, as opposed to coming in, as you say, that child. Because trust me, we've been there. We've
all been there,
and as adults as well. And I yet what you just described, you would never get in the workplace. So what you get instead are some much bigger flare-ups, to say the least. But honestly, what I picked up there is any stress that you bring into the scenario. What happens before the story is the story in many cases.
Well, it goes back, you mentioned Maslow and your studies, of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I go back to one of the first models I learned in university and studying the art of communication was that you have a sender and a receiver and a message. But then you have these sub-processes in between called encoding and decoding. And my background and my upbringing and everything that I bring to this environment is going to determine how I encode the message that I want to relay. And yet the receivers, at the receiver's end, their upbringing and the entire constellation of their life experiences are going to determine how they decode that message, which may be entirely different than what I intended with my encoding.
Yeah.
It all takes place within an environment where there is other noise, and I don't mean physical noise in terms of the ears, but other variables, hunger, other distractions, world events, things that are taking place that can either detract or enhance or magnify or monetize an event. So that those are all very important factors that we need to consider.
When I used to do a lot of collaboration, one of the first things that we always did was define words, whether or not they were acronyms or words, because you need to make sure you're speaking the same language, and once you got the basic building blocks of language, you can start communicating, and too many people just jump into the communication. And as you say, it's Greek to me, quite literally, or more importantly, you say something that's meant to mean X, but it means Y. And trust me, I've seen so many projects fail just purely on the misunderstanding of a concept. So the importance.
Well, and I just before you wrap up, Robert, I will touch one more thing.
Yeah,
and
go
I will
for
say
it.
that I was just going to say that the last thing I want to drive home is that universal language, that one piece of language that everybody understands, especially in the early years, is safety. When I speak in safe terms to a child, that's when I'm going to uncover what really lies beneath. So it's becoming fluent in speaking safety.
No, it only makes sense because you're not forcing defense mechanisms to go up.
Right.
Anything that brings up whatever those defense mechanisms or past behaviors or misunderstandings of what you're implying, because what you're saying is not necessarily what I'm hearing, as you point out. Those are all factors that will escalate a problem considerably faster. And this, like everything else, part of the process is to de-escalate and to buy time, regardless of whether or not you're talking police maneuvers or you're dealing with any conflict. It's how can I de-escalate this? There's a certain degree of EQ process that goes in there, as you pointed out, and all the time there you're trying to buy time, so that let's figure this out. And as you say, you step through the process. So
and then you get back to restoration.
Exactly. So I think that's probably a good point right there. But I want to talk just briefly more about restoration because I know it's a good word. God Almighty, it's a great word.
Yeah.
What are some of those moments that you've experienced where you've had that restoration process and you've seen a transformation? Because you would have seen children evolve past that point, 20 years in some cases, 5 years in some other cases. You've seen an impact of that. You've been able to gauge the stuff that you've admitted that you really want to focus on, and you could see that, lack of a better statement, experiment, progress over time because we're all iterations in some ways.
Without mentioning any names, certainly, I would never do that. But a case in a kindergarten class where I had a young child a few years ago who, again, had one of those mornings that typically evolved much like what, the cereal might have been spilled, the bus ride might have been a little uncomfortable, he may have been a little tired, whatever happened. But he arrived at school, and sure enough, during the first recess break, he got into a huge bout with
altercation.
One of his closest friends, and typically, had this been much earlier in my teaching career, I might have separated the two boys, brought them into the class, and said, "Okay, now you can't play with the rest of the group for this next little while because that's going to be your punishment."
Yeah.
So the fact that they didn't know how to interact meant that they were now going to not have the opportunity to interact. Which, now that I think of it, even in reflection, I think, what was I thinking at the time? Like, how is that possibly going to help these children learn how to interact more positively by preventing them from interacting?
But you needed to go through that iteration to be able to have the conversation that forced you to have the next iteration. So
and that's what happened was, when I looked at this situation, I thought, okay, boys, you're going to come work with Mr. Persia. Both of you are going to come. And I had one on one side and one on the other. And we modeled how to go through things. And then sure enough, after working together with a little while and talking about, what kind of day this boy was having and what kind of day this boy was having and what they were thinking and what they were feeling. And, in Mr. Persia's class, we talk about our feelings. And sure enough, off they went on their own a little while later, and they made each other a card without me ever having to tell them to make each other a card. So they went off and drew something, drew a picture, and sure enough, they went over to each other and said, "Here, I made this for you."
Nice, nice
So
touch.
those are the moments that occur far more often when we allow them to than we ever would have had we used the previous disciplinary model of, oh yeah, I'm going to show you because you couldn't interact well with your friends. Now you're not going to get the chance to interact with your friends.
Yeah. No, and like I said, I grew up where, the principal would walk into the room, pull the kid to the front of the class, and you get the whack in front of everybody, right? So obviously things have changed a bit over the years.
Well, and that what that does is instill in the rest of the children is that first of all, that's somebody to be avoided.
Oh yeah.
And certainly that compliance was the order of the day, not necessarily self-regulation, but
it was more of a headmaster model as opposed to a principal model, right? But so, we can't be hard on each other because there's what we knew at the time and what we know now, and
Maya Angelou.
Yeah.
One of the quotes I live by, one of the quotations I live by: "When we know better, we do better," and I continue to try to do better, my friend.
Yeah. Well, I use the term iterate towards success. Is every iteration a step in the right direction, and you got as many iterations as you want, and whether or not they're
I got 60 years worth of them, Robert.
Well, see, that's the thing. There's and this is maybe the point I was trying to get at. There are those, I believe, that come to a point where they decide whether or not that's enough to learn, and then there are those that continue. And the compound nature of education is understated beyond belief. Like, I'm not an intelligent guy at all. Like, I'm really stupid.
I would disagree.
No. I'm telling you right now, I can't tie my shoes. But what I was getting at is it's forced me in many cases to have to figure shit out myself or learn this or whatnot. And, the conversation I had earlier with someone else about the last 10 years, the stuff that we have to do ourselves now versus what we didn't know how to do 10 years ago, and having taught ourselves that has made us what we are. You know what I mean? And trust me, I love failures. I'm a huge believer that failures define individuals, and the more failures, the better, as long as you learn from them and you don't repeat them, right? But
you want to,
yeah.
There's a podcast I'm going to steer you towards. If you ever get a chance to listen to Stephanie Faye Frank, talks about neuroscience and the art of failure and how it leads to greater success. But the one last thought I want to leave you with, you talked about iteration towards success, Robert. I mentioned I have 60 years experience with. There's something to be said for having 60 years experience versus having 1 year experience 60 times.
Yeah, very much so. It like I said, the compound aspect is something that you can't understate. But it's that desire to continue, and there's sadly a lot that decide to go into old age and give up on that. Yeah. And I think that's when a lot of the brain stuff comes in. It's a muscle like everything else. You need to constantly be using it, or and
use it or lose it.
Well, it's like I said, the rest of my body is completely along for the ride as far as I'm concerned. There's only one part of me that truly matters, and it's the part that hasn't stopped improving over year, and you want to continue that, obviously. On that note, thank you for a wonderful chat. Once again, I've got all this wonderful gear, and at the end of the day, really all I want to do is have a good conversation, and you've definitely delivered on that, Mr. Joe Persia.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I look forward to our next chat on whatever subject you want to talk about. There's a lot looming very large on the horizon. We don't know what education is going to look like come this fall. We can certainly get back together and talk about that. Any number of topics that are of interest to us both, my friend. Always a pleasure.
I believe you will be on sooner than later. Take care, sir.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.